I'm a postdoc here in Jeff's lab, as Boris says. And today I'm going to chat to you about some of the research I've been doing over the past couple of years, kind of at the very tail end of my PhD, and then moving into my current postdoc, which is so far focused on the interactions between climate change and the salmon farming industry, and the implications for wild and farm fish moving forward. This is going to work. Yeah, so pathogens and parasites are emerging as one of the major threats to wildlife worldwide. We've seen huge population crashes recently in North American bats due to white nose syndrome, and mammals worldwide due to bovine tuberculosis, and honeybees because of varroa mites, and amphibians because of chytridiomycosis, and in many, many other species. And in each of these cases, and in many, many others, we've been trying to manage these diseases for years with limited to mixed success, because limiting the spread and impacts of diseases in wildlife is really difficult. One of the biggest questions that researchers and managers have right now with regards to wildlife disease is understanding and managing pathogens and parasites in wildlife in relation to climate change, wondering how and whether climate change will influence these dynamics, and especially in marine systems. And that's because managing these threats in marine wildlife is generally more difficult than in terrestrial wildlife. And that's because diseases on average spread 10 to 100 times faster on the ocean than on land. And because we often don't see the result of marine disease because everything is underwater. One of the major sources of concern for marine disease is aquaculture, the farming of aquatic organisms. So aquaculture operations typically raise a lot of organisms in a really small space. So like a nightclub in COVID, aquaculture facilities provide really ideal conditions for disease to proliferate. But aquaculture is a really important and necessary set of industries at the same time. We have a growing human population that has an ever increasing need for protein from seafood. Oh, right. And we need that protein to come from somewhere. But unfortunately, we can't fill that protein need from wild populations anymore. As you can see from these data from the FAO, our seafood production from wild capture fisheries plateaued in the early 1990s, and aquaculture has had to step in to fill that protein gap between what wild capture fisheries have historically provided and can now provide, and our growing human population and what it actually needs. And this explosion in aquaculture over the past few decades has been called the Blue Revolution. And on top of providing much needed protein to a growing human population, aquaculture is also a huge source of jobs worldwide. In North America, a lot of us think about aquaculture pretty often, but in reality, over 99% of these jobs and 99% of aquaculture truly are in places like Africa and Asia and Latin America, the Caribbean, at least portions of which are really stimulated economically by the jobs that these provide. Yeah, so despite the importance of salmon farming, of aquaculture generally, there's one form of it that's been particularly controversial, and that's salmon farming. I like showing this table sometimes when I give a talk about salmon farming, just because it gives some context for North Americans on aquaculture of fish species as a whole. I know that when I first started on this topic, and a lot of the North Americans that I talk to, when they think of aquaculture in general, they think of salmon farming because that's what we have here. But in reality, most fish aquaculture is freshwater, often in ponds or closed tank systems, and most of it in Asia. In fact, of the top 10 cultured fish species, only one is marine, and that's the Atlantic salmon that we know and love. And although it's 8th place in terms of tonnage, in terms of its biomass produced worldwide, it is by far the most valuable fish species that is cultured, and actually it's the most valuable aquaculture species that's cultured now. Part of this controversy has been because salmon are piscivorous, they eat other fish. So to farm salmon, you need to take fish out of the ocean to feed them. So in terms of biomass, they're not really producing a net positive in terms of reducing pressure on our ocean. What species go into that is obviously different than salmon though. But largely, but in general, the biggest issue that salmon farms are called out for is their effects on wild salmon populations via the transmission of pathogens and parasites, which we'll get into in a minute. So this is what a salmon farm looks like. It's a pretty photo. Each square on that farm is a single net pen holding Atlantic salmon. This is a pretty average farm. It might hold 500,000 fish. Bigger ones can hold upwards of 1 million. And these net pens are open to the environment, so they allow water as well as pathogens and parasites to pass freely through them. And they share the same nearshore habitat used by wild salmon. Something like 98 to 99% of farm salmon worldwide are Atlantic salmon. There are some Pacific salmon farms in BC, but there's only 6 or 7 of them. Almost all of the biomass is Atlantic salmon, even on the Pacific coast. And to give you a sense of how salmon farming fits into the Canadian aquaculture picture, in 2017, Pacific Canada had 96,000 tons of farm salmon produced, and Atlantic Canada was a little bit less. Really big numbers in terms of value, and about 64% of aquaculture production on the Pacific coast in Canada in 2017 was salmon and trout, and on the Atlantic coast it was 90% salmon. And because of the controversy surrounding its environmental effects, salmon farming makes the news regularly, which is something I have to talk about and deal with a lot in British Columbia, and less so when I give any talks on the Atlantic on the Atlantic coast. The public has really dialed into this issue, especially over here in BC. It makes the news both in BC and globally. So a couple examples here. This was last year, over 100 nations in BC demanded the removal of open net salmon farms in a really critical migration corridor for all the Fraser River fish. This was actually recently granted by DFO, and although there's some evidence that there might be some backstepping there. A couple years ago, kind of at the start of this, of some of these processes, members of several First Nations actually occupied salmon farms. And very recently, just in the last couple of weeks, there was a big report that came out that was published and picked up by international outlets like The Guardian regarding salmon farming and the potential damage that it's causing ecologically and how that might have economic impacts as well. And probably the biggest concern that has been raised about salmon farms worldwide has revolved around parasites called sea lice. So this is what they look like. This is not an average infestation. This is a really bad one on wild juvenile salmon. Those long white things are egg strings from adult females. And so sea lice are a group of parasites that live and feed on the surface tissue of fish. And salmon farms act as as reservoirs for them, from which sea lice can transfer between farm and wild salmon. And this is important because normally, like these parasites are native. So normally wild salmon will have some sea lice on them. You can ask fishers from as far back as 1940s, 1950s, they know, like, they've seen sea lice on salmon. But the important part that salmon farms play a role in is that normally wild juvenile salmon don't really get infested by sea lice, only the wild adults. And that's important because it's the wild juvenile ones that are really susceptible to their effects because they're smaller and they lack fully developed scales and immune systems to help protect them. So to kind of explain this and how this works. So on the outside of this illustration, you have kind of the normal salmon life cycle. So on the top right, you have the eggs that are laid in fresh water. These hatch and develop into eventually fry and smolts. Those fish then migrate out into the ocean. They migrate along the coastline out into deeper water, into the open ocean, where they grow into adults, where they stay for a year or several, depending on the species. And then when they're ready, they come back along the coast and up into their natal freshwater systems and spawn and make eggs, and the hatchery the cycle starts anew. And normally, juvenile salmon and adult salmon don't really overlap in time and space very much. For the most part, adult salmon, I'm talking in a Pacific Coast context, but I know it's kind of similar, at least for Atlantic salmon. The wild juvenile salmon, they leave their rivers in the spring, and the adults come back in the fall. And so there's not much opportunity for sea lice to move between the adults and the juveniles. Salmon farms kind of break this separation by providing these year-round reservoirs. So sea lice on the wild adults coming back in the fall can transfer to the farms. Over the winter on the farms, those sea lice then amplify, they proliferate, and then they're available to pass on to the wild juvenile salmon in the spring. And it's not like the juvenile salmon have to pass by individual net pens. It's kind of like a 30-kilometer plume of sea lice larvae around the farms. The effects of sea lice on farmed and wild salmon can be pretty severe in some cases. It really depends on the size of the fish, the species of the fish, species of the lice. But we know that sea lice can affect the behavior, the physiology, the swimming ability, the growth and body condition, the survival of the fish. They can influence how likely the fish are to be eaten by predators. And they can affect wild salmon at the population level as well. This has been found with large-scale experimental releases in Europe, and also less causative, but with correlational stock recruit studies in BC. And it's not just wild salmon that sea lice have an effect on. According to this recent study that focused on Norway, the biggest farming company in the world, sea lice are a major pest to the salmon farming industry. Every year, the industry loses roughly 9% of its revenues due to sea lice, because sea lice reduce the growth rate and body condition and survival of these harvestable fish. But a lot of this cost actually is because salmon farmers have to use really expensive treatments to control sea lice populations on their farms. And this is done in a number of ways. The kind of classic way is through an in-feed parasiticide, essentially a pesticide that coats the outside of the salmon feed. And then it gets exuded through the mucus of the fish, and the lice die as they're feeding on it and living on it. But over time, pretty much every region in the world, Pacific coast of Canada is lagging behind a little bit, but everywhere in the world, sea lice have developed resistance to that chemical in particular. And so there's many other alternative treatments that are being used, like hydrogen peroxide baths for the fish. There's biocontrols using wild wrasse, where they, and perch and other species, where they release a bunch of these smaller fish that will then eat sea lice off of the farm salmon. There's some infrastructure changes that have been trialed and used, especially in Europe, with regards to bubble netting or different ways to set up the net pen to try to limit sea lice growth. There's even new technology that involves lasers that manage to find sea lice on the fish in the net pens and then kill them with lasers. Although initial trials of those blinded a lot of fish because they saw their eyes as lice, but it's better now. And while trying to control sea lice can be tough and expensive, it can also have really positive conservation outcomes. So to walk you through this figure, on the x-axis here is year, and on the y-axis is the number of sea lice on wild juvenile salmon in a British Columbia monitoring program. And as you can see, early on in this time series, there were a lot of sea lice on these fish. And that was because there weren't really controls in place on the farms to control sea lice populations. So they exploded on the farms and then they exploded on the wild fish. In 2003, the government decided to look into this issue a bit, and the farms fallowed. They took out a bunch of fish from their farms and stopped working on a lot of their farms and in this specific region. And the sea lice on the wild juvenile salmon went down accordingly. And so in 2004 and 2005, there was some policy and management intervention that happened here to regulate when and how sea lice populations on farms needed to be controlled. And then after that, the number of sea lice on wild salmon went down drastically, and the associated mortality with it as well did. The concern moving forward is that we've seen some years since then where sea lice haven't been controlled as well on farm salmon and therefore on wild salmon as well. And what we and as kind of an initial teaser, what we found from this bump, this very first bump in 2015, was that this was associated with a warm year. And so, kind of moving forward, there's been a lot of questions on how warming especially in British Columbia and in Europe, in Norway, in the UK, a bit less so on the Atlantic coast, how a warm year will affect the salmon farming in general and their effects on wild fish. What happens in warm years? What will happen with parasites and pathogens on salmon farms as our climate changes? We know quite a bit about how sea lice affect their hosts, but we know nothing about whether these effects will change as our coastal oceans continue to warm. And this is really surprising because for a long time, we've known that as temperature increases, sea lice molt between stages more quickly. So their generation times are way faster when it's warmer. So this kind of leads me to the overarching question that I've had for the past couple of years is how will climate change influence the impacts of sea lice on wild and farm salmon? And I'm going to chat to you about two main kind of studies that we've been doing in relation to these questions. One is about sea lice abundance, and one is about their actual effects on their hosts and how these might change as coastal oceans continue to warm. So yes, this first one. Do warmer temperatures increase sea lice abundances? Just kind of lost my screen on salmon farms. So as I mentioned, I live in BC. A lot of my research is here. So this first study has a focus on British Columbia. BC has a lot of salmon farms. We have 91 salmon farms, I think, that were active in between 2011 and 2016, which is kind of the year range of this study. And BC is a really interesting place to study these issues because it's the only place in the world that produces a large portion of the world's wild and a large portion of the world's farm salmon. And in BC, this is a really big deal because wild salmon, to all the peoples of BC, they're of huge ecological, economic, and cultural importance. And it's a really hot button topic, mainly because of this. So over the course of the past 70 years, wild salmon catch has declined significantly, especially in the 90s. Some of this was due to fishing management intervention, but a lot of it is due to actual population declines in wild salmon. And at the same time, farm salmon production has rapidly increased to the point now that over 80% of salmon in British Columbia that are produced, that are caught or raised, are farmed. And while this relationship is purely two lines on a graph, it has a lot of people worried, especially members of the public. So in British Columbia, therefore, they have a lot more data on these issues than the Atlantic coast. which is something that I found quite interesting over the course of my postdoc. So salmon farms here are required to every couple weeks to a month, they have to count the number of sea lice on their fish. So they catch a subset of their fish and they anesthetize them and they count the number of sea lice on them. And then they have to report that to DFO, our federal fisheries organization, and they have to, and then those get publicly reported online. Obviously, there's a potential conflict of interest there where salmon farm companies have to count the sea lice themselves and then whose numbers then determine whether or not they are forced to do an expensive treatment. And so DFO tries to kind of ensure the accuracy of these counts by regularly auditing the salmon farms during their counts. And what that looks like is for about 5% of the counts, DFO will send out a couple people to do a simultaneous count to the industry one, and then they'll compare those and see if they're statistically similar. So for this analysis, I analyzed the publicly reported sea lice counts using kind of a population dynamics model to see whether we might expect, as our coastal oceans continue to warm, sea lice outbreaks on salmon farms to become worse, whether their abundances are going to get higher. And I'm not going to walk through the actual model itself. I think I might have actually talked about this a little bit a few years ago when I gave a departmental seminar here, but just kind of broad brushstrokes. We fit this model using Bayesian methods to these data as a function of where the next month's count was a function of whether treatment had happened recently, whether they had been audited recently, and this month's count, and then there was a population growth component that itself, for those that are interested, was kind of like a linear predictor in a GLMM that was itself predicted by factors like month and year and age class of the fish and things like that. And the same goes for a kind of a colonization component. So the sea lice coming from external sources onto farms. But I'm not going to focus on the model itself, just the results. But one of the most interesting results that we found, which doesn't have to do with this climate change issue, is kind of raised our eyebrows in that counts across the board after you accounted for all these other factors, counts across the board were lower when DFO wasn't there. So what we found was that for both species of sea lice, so red is one species, blue is another, when DFO wasn't auditing, which is 95% of the time, counts decreased. So for one of the species, counts decreased by 50%, and for another it was like 18%, which was really surprising. And when we published that paper, there was a lot of press about it. It was a very interesting time in my life in the fall. Probably drank more beer than I normally did because there was a kind of a media and public outcry that salmon farms were cheating on their sea lice counts, which certainly wasn't what our paper said, but it was definitely picked up on that. Since then, there's been some really interesting chats with DFO here, and they're actually tweaking their audit program a bit to try to ensure the accuracy of these counts, which then we had some really good conversations about it, which was great. But this is what the observed sea lice counts look like over the course of this time series. So on the y-axis is just the sea lice count on salmon farms on average, and x-axis is the year. And the kind of gold highlight there is the important bit, because that is the time period during the juvenile salmon migration, when wild salmon are migrating along the coast past these salmon farms. And so for the most part, management is set up to minimize sea lice during that critical time period. And similar to that time series earlier that showed that 2015 had really high wild counts, 2015 also had really high farm counts during that critical period. And what we found was that this seemed to be because of this high temperature that happened in 2015. So I'm just going to walk you through a quick figure with predictions from our results. So on the x-axis here is just an average year from January to December. And the y-axis is like a simulated or predicted count from on the farms in both an average year and a high temperature year, like the conditions from 2015. We have the kind of mean prediction here, where the counts go down between March and June, that critical kind of wild salmon migration period. This is the uncertainty around that, with 50% and 95% credible intervals, I think. And then in a high temperature year, we see that this would get a lot higher. And in fact, it's during the juvenile salmon migration, these counts are 2.5 times higher. So using this model that we fit to these empirical data, we could then tweak it and run some simulation to see, okay, this is how it works under kind of the status quo management regime. What happens if we impose some theoretical management changes here? Can we make this better so that management is more resilient to changes in environmental conditions moving forward? And what we found several things, but one of the key ones was that if you do a precautionary treatment before the wild salmon migration, if you do one in February, regardless of whether counts are high, what you see is that even in high temperature years, we should bring down that average sea lice abundance during the juvenile salmon migration to that of a normal year. This was a pretty important result, and this exact kind of management strategy has been implemented in one of the salmon farming hotspots in British Columbia, the Broughton Archipelago, specifically to try to ensure that counts are as low as they can be during the juvenile salmon migration, even in warm years. So the second study I'm going to chat to you about is one that I actually did at with several others at the Dalhousie Aquatron facilities. So 2019, I came over for what was supposed to be 3 months, but ended up being something like 6. We ran this kind of big manipulative experiment in the Dalhousie Aquatron that tried to address this question of whether warmer temperatures accentuate the actual effects of sea lice on Atlantic salmon. Sorry, my screen has done a weird thing. Okay, there we go. So over the past decade, researchers have kind of started to understand how climate change may in some cases impact the distribution, the prevalence, the development of diseases in wildlife, but in some cases not. And what we really lack is solid experimental evidence on how climate can impact the severity, the actual impacts of diseases on their hosts, especially marine systems. So to address this novel gap, we developed a pretty involved experiment that I'm going to walk through with you here, assuming the slides are timed to me. Which they might not be. Okay. So we set up a bunch of 90-liter flow through seawater tanks. These are the kind of blue cylinders on the screen. And we got just over 1,000 100-gram Atlantic salmon from a hatchery that produces fish for closed containment salmon farms in Nova Scotia. The keen eyed among you might notice that this is actually a Chinook salmon, not an Atlantic, but we'll just ignore that. We injected pit tags into these fish so that we could scan and identify individuals later. And then we weighed and measured the fish before. These slides are really delayed for me, I'm sorry. We weighed and measured the fish before splitting them among the tanks. Okay. We then gradually adjusted the tank temperatures into one of 5 levels, ranging from 10 degrees to 22 degrees. And 1/3 of the tanks we left exactly like that. And then another 1/3 of the tanks we infested with a relatively low abundance of sea lice. And then finally, we infested the final 1/3 of the tanks with a relatively high abundance of sea lice. So the kind of low abundance was kind of the number of sea lice that you might see on a British Columbia salmon farm, and the high abundance was kind of what you might see on an Atlantic salmon farm on average. Finally, so in the end, we ended up having 5 temperature treatments, as well as 3 infestation levels, 0, low, and high, for a total of 15 combinations of temperature and infestation. And each of these combinations was done in triplicate. So in total, we had 15 times 3 tanks. We have 45 tanks of fish. We monitored mortalities every day over the course of the experiment. And once the sea lice developed into adults, we euthanized the fish in each tank. We scanned their pit tags to identify them, which one was which, and then we weighed and measured them again. And I've presented this research just once before at a conference, and I didn't include this slide, but I thought it might be interesting for those of you in Halifax. This is just a figure with the temperature from the individual tanks. There are actually 45 slightly transparent lines here, but they obviously all mostly group together into 5 kind of categories. So each of these is an individual tank and its temperature over the course of the experiment. They had little loggers in it. And there was supposed to be one that had 9 of them that were at 10 degrees and then 13 degrees and 16. What you see is that this didn't happen. And that's because on day 0, the day that we infected the fish, Hurricane Dorian hit Halifax. And it shut down all the power at Dow. It shut down the backup generators as well in some cases. It mixed up all of the water in the Halifax harbor, which is where the Aquatron gets its water from. And so basically all of the Aquatron staff, in addition to trying to make sure that none of the other fish died, that they take care of, they also had to try to handle the crazy temperature fluctuations and the lack of power needed to manage the temperature at the start of this experiment. So luckily they did an amazing job, and they kept this separation between the different temperature treatments. They weren't exactly at 10 or 13 or 16, but that didn't honestly matter too much. And I am forever indebted to the incredible work of the Aquatron staff, because for a little while it looked like this experiment was just dead on arrival. So this is, oh yeah, and actually, so these are just some photos from the Aquatron. This is, for those of you that aren't aware, these are a great set of facilities at the bottom of the Life Science building. Yeah, so at the start of the experiment, we housed tanks in these kind of really, really big tanks while we were waiting for sea lice and all the logistical stuff to get in place. And then we eventually moved them into these smaller flow-through tanks to infest the fish in. By the end of the experiment, the fish were like 100 to 150 gram and 20 to 30 centimeters in length. And the infestation definitely worked. On the right, you can see an image of a post-molt that had been had the dorsal surface of its head essentially fed on by several sea lice, causing that big lesion that you see there. So the main question that we were trying to ask, as I mentioned, is do warmer temperatures accentuate the negative effects of sea lice infestation on Atlantic salmon? And I'm going to talk about kind of 3 main results from this experiment. So how temperature modulated the effects of sea lice on the growth of the salmon, on the body condition, and on their survival. So I'm going to walk you through this figure. So on the x-axis here, we have temperature, and the y-axis, we have growth rate from the start of the experiment to the end of the experiment. The line at 0 kind of denotes where fish would neither have gained nor lost weight between the beginning and end of the experiment, when fish were exposed to sea lice to when the sea lice had developed into adults. And here are the data for uninfested fish, and what we see is that as temperature increases, the growth rate of the fish decreased, so which was fully expected. For the low infestation, we saw the same thing, but a steeper decline in growth rate as temperature increased. And then same thing for high infestation, to the point that growth rate actually became negative at the highest temperatures. So the fish lost weight over the course of the experiment. And we fit, for those that are interested, we fit a suite of mixed effects models to these data with different combinations of predictors. And the best one after model selection was the model that included an interaction term between temperature and infestation level. And the lines that you see here are derived from those parameter estimates from that top model. So to kind of summarize that, what we found was that increasing temperature did indeed accentuate the effect of sea lice on salmon body growth. So onto the second result, which was body condition. This is a very similar figure with temperature on the x-axis. And this time, the change in body condition from the beginning of the experiment to the end of the experiment on the y-axis. And for those of you who don't deal with fish regularly, body condition is basically a metric of how plump a fish is, I guess. And up to a certain point, the more plump, the better. So what we see in the uninfested fish is this nonlinear relationship where change in condition declines only really at the higher temperatures. And for lightly infested fish, this decline at higher temperatures was exacerbated. And for the highly infested fish, this was even more so the case. So as for the body growth result, we fit a suite of mixed effects models to these data. And it was statistically clear that the best model was one that included an interaction term between infestation level and temperature. So again, we found that increasing temperature exacerbated the negative effects of sea lice, this time on the relative change in body condition. And finally, the survival data, and these are the final results I'm gonna present today, I think. This figure is a little different. It's got 5 panels, one for each temperature treatment. And these are survival curves. So on the x-axis, you have the number of days since infestation, since the fish were infested with sea lice, and the y-axis is survival probability. And for the 10-degree treatment, what we saw was that there was high survival throughout the entire experiment with barely any difference at all in the survival curves between the 3 infestation levels. At 13 degrees, it was pretty much the same story with slightly lower survival. At 16 degrees, we started to see a bit of separation between the survival curves at the 3 infestation levels. At 19 and 22 degrees, it's really obvious that at higher temperatures, the effect of sea louse infestation on survival was exacerbated, especially for the highly infected fish. And so, yeah, you'll notice that actually over the that these survival curves are shorter. They span fewer days at higher temperatures, and that's because, as I mentioned before, sea lice develop more quickly at higher temperatures. And we ran the experiment over the course of 1 sea louse life cycle, so the experiment was just shorter at higher temps. But again, it was the same story. It was statistically clear that the best survival model was one that included an interaction term between temperature and infestation. So coming back to our original question, we found that the consequences of sea louse infestation for juvenile Atlantic salmon do seem to be mediated by temperature. The results were pretty clear. And as temperature increased, so too did the effects of sea lice on the growth rate, the body condition, and the survival of the hosts. I'm just gonna say one last thing about this experiment. I had a wonderful undergrad who did her honors thesis with Jeff and I, and she put up with a lot during this experiment, and she actually designed her own experiment, like subset of this for her honors. And what she found was that at higher sea lice abundances and at higher temperatures, salmon livers are smaller and their hearts are larger. And actually this implies that at higher temps and at higher infestation levels, sea lice may reduce the liver energy stores of the fish and reduce cardiac performance. Kind of counterintuitively, when stress and cortisol are involved, the bigger the heart is, the worse the performance is. And this paper was actually just published last week, and it was her first authored paper, so I'm pretty stoked for her. And her name was Kate Metcalf, in case I didn't say that. So to kind of wrap this up, I think the timing's pretty good. So to summarize, kind of from this research that I presented, we expect both the abundance and the effects of sea lice to increase as our coastal oceans continue to warm. And these results probably have some pretty big economic and ecological implications. It's tough sometimes to extrapolate from experimental studies, but in this case, sea lice are the biggest pest to the salmon farming industry. They're the main challenge that a lot of people see in terms of their potential impacts on wild salmon population. They're definitely the most researched component of that. And so there could be some really economic and ecological implications of climate change to this really important social ecological system of farmed and wild salmon. And these climate-driven effects could also result in really big reductions in profit for the salmon farming industry. So it's not just wild salmon at risk here. It may have pretty big impacts on the salmon farming industry moving forward as waters continue to warm. So ultimately, we need to really improve the relevant policies, both in Canada and globally, so that our parasite management strategies in aquaculture are resilient to environmental change for both the sake of wild salmon, but also for farmed salmon as well. So to wrap up, I would like to thank kind of the three main funders for most of this research for my Libre Arrow Fellowship, the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation, and ANSERC. I was supervised by Jeff and had some absolutely wonderful co-authors, and I think there were something like 20, 25 people that helped out at different stages of this experiment at the Aquatron. It couldn't have been done with the help of all these people, especially the Aquatron crew. So I'm very, very grateful for that support. So yeah, that's it from me. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. So thank you very, very much.